down. In that case, the procedure will be brake before entering the turn. In the turn itself, keep your foot over the brake in case you need to brake in an emergency, but don't brake or brake very lightly. Then when exiting the turn, start accelerating just a bit before your car is straight. You should have adjusted your speed before entering the turn so that you don't need to brake in the turn itself. So brake before the turn, release in the turn itself, accelerate while exiting the turn. That's what you'll need to do most of the time. But that depends on how tight the turn is and how fast you're going when entering it. If you're approaching the turn already at the speed you should have in the turn itself, you won't need to slow down. Like in this 50 km/h zone, for example, where I'm already at 50 while entering this wide turn. Same thing for a very wide turn, even on the highway like in this situation. I'm already at 100 km/h, but I don't need to slow down since the turn is so wide. But if you live in a city like mine, where most of the turns are at 90 degrees or sometimes sharper, if you're approaching them at 50 km/h, you'll need to slow down. The tighter the turn, the more you'll need to slow down. And if you're approaching it slower than the turn speed, like after having stopped, obviously you'll have to accelerate a bit. So when do you need to brake, accelerate, or do nothing? It depends on how tight the turn is and at what speed you're entering it. Now this being said, at what speed exactly should we take the turns? Now something you might have heard a lot, especially if you drive in a city where turns at intersections are mostly 90 degrees, is to turn at certain speeds, like for example 15 km/h when turning right and 20 when turning left. The thing is, that will depend on a few things, like the width of the intersection for example. The wider the intersection, the more distance you have to pick up speed. Also, when you'll be driving in roads where the curves are all different, you're not going to bring a spreadsheet with the speed for every single curve, are you? And most of all, one of the biggest problems with a lot of students is that they tend to stare at things for too long. For example, when they look at the mirror, they tend to stare at it for a second or two. And they also tend to stare at the speedometer when checking their speed. That's never a good idea, but especially when turning. If you get used to looking at your speedometer when turning, you won't be looking at where you're supposed to go. And that could be very dangerous in some situations. Like for example, if someone is crossing the street at the curve and you won't see them. So don't get used to looking at your speedometer when turning. Look at where you want to go, and your brain will coordinate your hands and feet. It might take a few practices before you get the hang of it, but once you do, you'll be able to take on any curve at any angle. If you do want to look at the speedometer to get a feel for your speed, do it quickly. Just a few quick glances at it before the turn and get back to looking at where you need to go. But I recommend you get used to adapting your speed by looking at the right place. Ask an experienced driver to tell you at what speed they do their turns, and they won't be able to tell you because they were analyzing the curve before turning and looking at the curve itself when turning, not at their speedometer.